In the quiet neighborhoods just outside Atlanta, where the trees grew tall and the sidewalks cracked from years of Georgia heat, lived a 16-year-old named Kofi. He didn't have much. His sneakers were worn thin at the soles, his backpack patched with duct tape, and his phone hadn't worked properly in months. But he had something most kids his age didn't: a sharp mind and a quiet kind of courage. Kofi lived with his grandmother, Ms. Dolores, in a small house with peeling paint and a front porch that creaked when you stepped on the third plank from the left. His father had passed away when he was 9, killed in a construction accident, and his mother had drifted out of his life not long after. Lost to struggles Kofi was too young to understand at the time. But Ms. Dolores, she held things together with grit, prayer, and a steady hand. She worked part-time at a church kitchen, and every night, no matter how tired, she made sure Kofi had something warm on his plate and a clean uniform for school the next morning. After school, Kofi didn't hang out at the mall or scroll through videos like most of his classmates. Instead, he walked 10 blocks to a small auto repair shop called Hank's Garage. Hank, a grizzled man in his 60s with oil permanently stained into his fingernails, had taken Kofi under his wing a couple of years back. At first, Kofi just swept floors and fetched tools, but soon Hank noticed how the boy watched everything, how he asked questions, remembered fixes, and even stayed late to read service manuals by the dim light of the shop's back room. "You got a mechanic's brain, kid," Hank once said, tossing him a wrench. "But your eyes? They're always looking up." He was right. Kofi wasn't just interested in cars, he was obsessed with planes. Ever since he was little, he'd sit with his dad on weekends at the edge of the local airport fence watching jets roar into the sky. His dad would point out models, explain how engines worked, and tell him stories about pilots who'd saved lives by noticing tiny things others missed. Those afternoons were Kofi's happiest memories. After his dad was gone, those stories became his anchor. Now, years later, Kofi spent his free time on aviation forums, reading accident reports, studying schematics of private jets, and even building flight simulators on old laptops he'd fixed himself. He couldn't afford flying lessons, but he knew more about aircraft systems than most licensed pilots his age. It wasn't bragging, it was just how his mind worked. Details mattered to him. A loose bolt, a strange smell, a flickering light. Those weren't just quirks. To Kofi, they were warnings. One Thursday afternoon, the Georgia sun hung heavy in the sky as Kofi walked home from Hank's. His shirt was streaked with grease, and his arms ached from helping replace a transmission all afternoon. He took his usual shortcut past the DeKalb Peachtree Airport's private terminal, a place most locals never visited. It was a world away from the crowded commercial terminals, quiet, gated, and guarded, where billionaires and celebrities came and went in sleek jets that cost more than entire neighborhoods. Kofi didn't usually stop there, but that day something made him slow down. A Gulfstream G650 sat on the tarmac, its polished silver body gleaming under the sun. Ground crew moved around it with practiced efficiency, loading luggage, checking instruments, running final diagnostics. Kofi watched for a moment, not out of envy but habit. He liked seeing how things were done right. Then he saw it. Near the left engine, a fuel line connection looked off. The clamp securing it wasn't flush, it was slightly twisted like someone had rushed the job. That alone might have been a mistake. But then Kofi caught a whiff in the air, sharp, chemical, almost like nail polish remover. Acetone. He'd read about it before. In aviation circles, that smell near fuel systems was a red flag. It could mean someone had used solvents to weaken seals or mask tampering. His stomach dropped. He took a few steps closer, squinting. The more he looked, the more wrong it felt. The wiring near the auxiliary power unit also seemed disturbed. Wires rerouted in a way that didn't match standard Gulfstream layouts. And the smell. It was stronger now. Kofi's heart started pounding. He knew what this could mean. If that plane took off with a compromised fuel line and possible chemical residue near hot components, it could ignite mid-air. Or worse, the system could fail entirely at cruising altitude. There'd be no time to react. Inside the terminal, a man in a tailored suit stepped out, flanked by 2 security guards. Kofi recognized him from business news clips. Elias Thorne, the founder of Viridian Dynamics, a tech empire worth billions. He was known for being brilliant, ruthless, and intensely private. Rumor had it he never gave interviews and rarely left his gated estate. The guards ushered him toward the jet. Elias walked with the calm confidence of someone used to being in control, of companies, of people, of outcomes. Kofi didn't think. He just moved. He jogged toward the gate, waving his arms. "Sir, wait," he called out. A guard stepped in front of him instantly, hand on his earpiece. "You can't be here, kid. Move along." "But the plane," Kofi started. "Now," the guard said firmly, stepping closer. Kofi's voice cracked with urgency. "Your plane was sabotaged. Don't fly." The words cut through the humid air like a blade. Everyone froze. Elias turned. His eyes, cold and calculating at first, locked onto Kofi. He looked the boy up and down, scuffed shoes, grease on his sleeves, face flushed from running. Not a threat, just a kid. But there was something in Kofi's eyes that wasn't fear or panic. It was certainty. Elias raised a hand, stopping his guards. "What did you say?" Kofi swallowed hard but stood his ground. "The fuel line on the left engine, it's not secured right. And there's acetone near the tail. Someone tampered with it. If you take off like this, you might not make it." Silence stretched for a long moment. The ground crew exchanged glances. One of the mechanics frowned and walked toward the engine Kofi had pointed to. Elias studied Kofi. "How do you know this?" "I read accident reports. I fix engines, and I've been watching planes since I was 6, Kofi said, voice steadier now. "That smell? That's not normal. And that clamp? It's backwards." Elias didn't smile, didn't thank him, but he nodded once, sharply, and turned to his head of security. "Call the chief mechanic. Full inspection. Now." What followed was tense. The mechanic crawled under the wing, flashlight in hand. Within minutes his expression changed. He radioed for backup. Then another technician arrived, then another. They pulled panels, tested lines, sniffed the air near the tail. 20 minutes later, the lead mechanic approached Elias, face pale. "Sir, you were right not to board. The fuel pressure regulator was deliberately misaligned, and there's residue of a flammable solvent near the APU exhaust. If you'd taken off, we might have lost the entire system within 30 minutes. Elias didn't react outwardly, but his jaw tightened. He turned to Kofi, who still stood near the gate, hands shoved in his pockets, trying to look calm. "Your name?" Elias asked. "Kofi." "Kofi what?" "Just Kofi," he said softly. Elias held his gaze for a long moment. Then, without another word, he walked back into the terminal, but not before giving a quiet order to his assistant. "Find out everything about that boy." Kofi walked home that evening with his heart still racing. He didn't tell Ms. Dolores what happened. He didn't want to worry her. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he kept replaying the moment, the look in Elias's eyes, the silence after he'd shouted, the way the world had seemed to hold its breath. He hadn't done it for thanks. He hadn't done it for money or fame. He'd done it because he'd seen something wrong, and he couldn't walk away. What he didn't know was that the next morning a black SUV with tinted windows would pull up to his grandmother's house. And the man who stepped out wouldn't be a reporter, a lawyer, or a security guard. It would be Elias Thorne himself, alone, carrying a duffel bag and a folder, and the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of Kofi's bedroom, casting long stripes across the floor. He'd barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Gulf Stream on the tarmac, heard his own voice shouting into the humid air, felt the weight of that silence that followed. He kept wondering, had he overreacted, made a fool of himself, or worse, had he imagined the whole thing? By the time he shuffled into the kitchen, Ms. Dolores was already at the stove, frying bacon and humming an old gospel tune. She turned, took one look at his tired eyes, and said, "You been wrestling with ghosts again, child." Kofi shrugged, pouring himself a glass of orange juice. "Just thinking." "Well, thinking don't pay the light bill," she said gently, sliding a plate toward him. "Eat, you got school." He nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He checked his phone, no messages, no news alerts, nothing. Maybe it really was nothing. Maybe the billionaire had brushed it off as a false alarm and flown out on another jet by now. Kofi hoped so. He didn't need attention. He just needed to know he hadn't been wrong. But around 10 o'clock, as he walked to the bus stop, a black SUV rolled slowly down the street. It wasn't flashy, just clean, quiet, expensive in a way that didn't scream for notice. It stopped right in front of his house. Kofi froze. The window rolled down. Not a guard, not a driver. The man himself, Elias Thorne, stepped out. He wore a simple navy shirt, no tie, and his shoes looked like they'd never touched mud. But there was no entourage, no earpiece, no sunglasses hiding his eyes. Just him. Ms. Dolores appeared on the porch, broom in hand, squinting like she was sizing up a stray dog that might bite. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice sharp but calm. Elias didn't smile. He didn't introduce himself with a title or a company name. He just said, "I owe your grandson my life." That stopped her cold. Kofi walked over slowly, heart thudding. "Mr. Thorne?" "Call me Elias," he said. Then he looked at Ms. Dolores. "May I sit with you for a few minutes?" "I won't take much of your time." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the porch. "Tea's hot." They sat on mismatched chairs under the shade of the oak tree. Elias accepted a chipped mug without comment. For a while, no one spoke. Then he turned to Kofi. "The inspection confirmed everything you said. Worse, actually. There was a small incendiary device hidden near the auxiliary power unit, designed to ignite after takeoff. If we'd left, there wouldn't have been a crash site. Just debris." Kofi's hands tightened around his mug. He hadn't seen that part. "But he believed it. Why me?" Kofi asked quietly. "Why come here?" "Because you're the only reason I'm still breathing," Elias said. "And I don't believe in coincidences. You saw something no trained mechanic caught. You spoke up when no one else would. That's not luck. That's character." He set the duffel bag on the small table between them. "I brought you a few things." Inside were a brand new laptop, a stack of aviation textbooks, real ones, not online PDFs, and a prepaid card loaded with enough for flight simulator software and internet for a year. At the bottom was a letter from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, addressed to Kofi, marked Preliminary Interest Talent Recognition Program. Kofi stared at it like it might vanish. I didn't do it for this." "I know," Elias said simply. "That's why you deserve it." Ms. Dolores watched them both, her expression softening. She'd seen enough in her 70 years to know when someone meant what they said. "You planning to stick around?" she asked Elias. He met her eyes. "Not unless you invite me. But I'd like to help, if you'll let me." Over the next hour they talked, not as billionaire and boy, but as people. Elias learned about Kofi's father, the garage, the dreams that felt too big for their little house. Kofi learned that Elias had grown up in a crowded apartment in Detroit, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs, and that he'd once been turned away from an engineering program because he didn't fit the profile. "You remind me of who I used to be," Elias admitted. "Before money made me careful. Before I started trusting spreadsheets more than people." Before he left, Elias made no grand promises. "No, I'll pay for everything, just this. Let me open a few doors. You walk through them." Kofi agreed, but only if it didn't change who he was. No fancy clothes, no interviews, no spotlight. Elias nodded. "Fair enough." That night, Kofi stayed up late, setting up the laptop, flipping through the textbooks, running his fingers over the embossed university logo. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a distant dream. It felt close. Real. But while Kofi dreamed of runways and altimeters, Elias returned to his penthouse with a different kind of urgency. He called his head of security, a former FBI agent named Reyes, and gave one order. "Find out who tried to kill me." The investigation began quietly. No press, no police, just internal audits, travel logs, maintenance records. Within days, a pattern emerged. The sabotage required inside knowledge. Elias's flight schedule, the jet's maintenance cycle, even the brand of fuel used. Only a handful of people had access to all that. One name kept appearing, Roland Vexley, his CFO for 12 years. Loyal, efficient, always 2 steps ahead. But recently, Roland had been acting strangely. Delaying financial reviews, pushing back on merger details, making uncharacteristic errors in quarterly reports. Elias dug deeper. Buried in offshore accounts, disguised as consulting fees, were millions siphoned from Viridian over the past 3 years. Roland wasn't just stealing. He was building an escape plan, and Elias's upcoming merger would trigger a forensic audit, one that would expose everything. So Roland had decided to eliminate the problem before it found him. Elias felt a cold anger settle in his chest, not just betrayal that he could handle, but the fact that Roland had risked innocent lives, ground crew, pilots, maybe even Kofi, If the explosion had been bigger, that was unforgivable. Still, Elias didn't call the authorities yet. He wanted to see Roland's face when he realized his plan had failed, not because of luck, but because of a kid who noticed a loose clamp and a strange smell. Meanwhile, Kofi's life began to shift in small, steady ways. Hank noticed the new laptop and raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. At school, Kofi started staying after class to work with the physics teacher on aerodynamics projects. He even joined the robotics club, using his new knowledge to help design a drone with stabilized flight controls. But then, things got strange. First, an anonymous message appeared in his school email. Mind your own business. You got lucky once. Then his locker was broken into. Nothing stolen, but his aviation notebook was torn in half and left on the floor. A few days later, someone keyed his bike outside the garage. Kofi didn't tell anyone at first. He didn't want to seem paranoid. But when he mentioned it casually to Elias during a weekly check-in call, the billionaire's voice changed. Stay inside after dark, Elias said. Don't walk alone. And if anyone approaches you, call me immediately. The next day, a quiet man in a plain sedan began parking down the street from Kofi's house. He never got out. Just sat reading a newspaper, watching. Kofi asked Ms. Dolores if she'd noticed him. She nodded. Said he's with security, sent by that Thorne man. Told me he's here to keep an eye, not make trouble. Kofi felt uneasy, but also protected. It was a strange feeling being looked after. Then came the call from Elias. I found who did it, he said. And I want you to meet him. Kofi's stomach dropped. Why? Because he needs to see you. And you deserve to hear it from him. 2 days later, a car picked Kofi up after school. Not the black SUV, but a modest sedan. They drove to a quiet office building downtown. Not Viridian's gleaming tower, but a smaller, older one with ivy climbing the brick walls. Inside a small conference room, a man sat alone. He looked nothing like the sharp-dressed executive from news photos. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling slightly on the table. When Kofi walked in, the man stood up slowly. You're just a kid, he whispered. Kofi didn't say anything. He just waited. The man, Roland, sank back into his chair. I have a son, he said, voice cracking. He's 17. Plays trumpet in the school band. Thinks he wants to be an architect. He looked at Kofi. Really looked at him. If someone had saved him the way you saved Mr. Thorne, I'd give anything, everything. Kofi didn't feel anger, not yet. Just sadness for the man across the table, for the choices that led him here, for the fact that greed could make someone forget what really mattered. Elias stood by the window, silent, watching. Roland reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope. This is for you. A full scholarship fund, not just for flight school, for anything you want to study. Medical school, engineering, art, whatever calls you. Kofi didn't take it right away. Why? Because you did the right thing when no one was watching, Roland said. And I did the worst thing when everyone trusted me. For the first time, Kofi saw not a villain but a broken man, trapped by his own choices, drowning in regret. He took the envelope. Not for the money, but because accepting it meant Roland had to face what he'd done. As they left the building, Elias walked beside Kofi in silence for a while. Then he said, You handled that like someone twice your age. Kofi shook his head. I just didn't want to hate him. That's the hardest part, Elias said softly. And the most important. That night, Kofi sat on the porch with Ms. Dolores, the envelope on his lap. She didn't ask what was inside. She just handed him a slice of peach cobbler and said, You doing all right, baby? He nodded. Yeah, Grandma. I think I am. And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. Life settled into a strange kind of rhythm after that meeting. Kofi kept going to school, kept helping Hank at the garage, kept studying late into the night with his new laptop glowing on the kitchen table. But things weren't the same, not really. The world felt bigger now, like he'd stepped through a door he didn't even know was there, and though he tried to act normal, people noticed. Teachers asked if he was applying to special programs. Friends wondered why he suddenly had a laptop that cost more than their parents' cars. He never bragged. He just smiled and said, Got lucky. But luck wasn't the right word. It was choice. His choice to speak up, and now he had to live with what came after. Elias stayed in touch. Not with grand gestures, but small ones. A text checking if the flight simulator was working. A note slipped into Kofi's mailbox with a link to a rare aviation manual. Once he even showed up at Hank's garage under the pretense of getting his car checked, just so he could watch Kofi work on an engine and ask him questions about torque and compression ratios. Hank, sharp as ever, saw right through it. "You ain't here for the oil change," he muttered, but he didn't say more. What Kofi didn't know was that behind the scenes, Elias was moving pieces like a chess player who just realized the game was personal. He'd let Roland walk free for now, but only because he wanted the truth to come out the right way. No headlines. No courtroom drama. Just accountability, face to face. But danger doesn't always knock politely. One rainy Tuesday, Kofi stayed late at school to help set up for a science fair. By the time he stepped outside, the streetlights were on and the sidewalk slick with rain. He pulled his hood up and started walking, hands in his pockets, thinking about a problem he'd been working on, how to stabilize drone flight in crosswinds. Halfway home, a dark sedan slowed beside him. Kofi's steps faltered. He didn't look up, just kept walking, faster now. The car rolled alongside him for a block, then pulled ahead and stopped. Two men got out. Not security, not police. They wore plain clothes but moved like they knew how to handle themselves. "Kofi," one of them called, voice too calm. He stopped. "Yeah? We just need to talk." 5 minutes. Kofi's pulse jumped, but he kept his voice steady. "About what?" The man glanced around. "About the other day. About Mr. Thorne. You said some things. Maybe you saw more than you let on." Kofi's stomach tightened. He hadn't told anyone about the incendiary device. Only Elias and his security team knew that detail, which meant these men weren't working alone. They were connected to someone inside. "I saw what I saw," Kofi said. "That's it." The second man took a step closer. "Kid, you're in over your head. Walk away. Forget you ever saw that plane." Kofi didn't flinch. "I can't unsee it." For a long moment, no one moved. Rain dripped off the brim of the first man's hat. Then from down the street, headlights cut through the gloom. A familiar black SUV slowed to a stop. The window rolled down. "Everything all right here?" Elias's voice was calm, but it carried weight. The two men exchanged a look. Without another word, they got back in their car and drove off. Elias didn't get out. He just waited until Kofi reached the SUV, then unlocked the door. "Get in." Inside, the air was warm and dry. Elias handed him a towel. "You okay?" Kofi nodded, wiping rain from his face. "Who were they?" "People who don't like loose ends," Elias said quietly. "And you, Kofi, are a very loose end." That night, Elias made a decision. No more half measures. He called Reyes and gave new orders. Full protection detail for Kofi and Ms. Dolores, discreet but constant. He also pulled Kofi out of public school, not permanently, but temporarily, and enrolled him in a private aviation prep program under a pseudonym, K. Dawson. The school was small, tucked away in a quiet part of Cobb County, focused on STEM and flight theory. Most students came from military or aviation families. No one asked questions. Kofi was nervous at first. He didn't fit in with kids who'd been flying since they were 12, whose parents owned hangars and spoke in aviation jargon like it was their first language. But he didn't try to impress them. He just listened, learned, and when he spoke, it was with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned his knowledge the hard way. And slowly, they respected him for it. Back at Viridian, Elias confronted Roland again, but this time with evidence. Bank records, email trails, security footage from the hangar showing Roland meeting with a former mechanic who'd been fired for substance abuse. The mechanic had bragged in a bar about doing a favor for a rich guy who wanted a problem to disappear. Roland broke down in Elias's office. "I didn't want you dead," he sobbed. I panicked. I thought if you were gone, the audit would stop. I could fix it. Pay it back. Start over." "But you were willing to kill to buy time," Elias said, voice cold. "You risked everyone on that plane. Ground crew, pilots, innocent people." Roland buried his face in his hands. "I have a son," he whispered again, like it was the only thing that still mattered. Elias leaned forward. "Then you'll do the right thing now. You'll confess, return every stolen dollar, and you'll apologize not to me, to Kofi." Roland looked up, stunned. "He's just a kid." "He's the reason you're still breathing free air," Elias said. "So yes, you'll look him in the eye and tell him what you did." The legal process moved quietly. Roland signed a full confession, agreed to repay the embezzled funds, and accepted a plea deal that included community service and probation. No jail time, but his career was over. Elias made sure the terms protected Kofi's privacy. No media, no court appearances, just closure. But before the deal was finalized, Elias arranged one last meeting. This time it was at Kofi's house. Ms. Dolores answered the door, arms crossed, but she recognized Roland from the news. She didn't invite him in, just stepped onto the porch and said, "You got 5 minutes." Roland stood on the sidewalk, rain misting his shoulders, holding a simple folder. When Kofi came out, Roland's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," he said, voice shaking. "I don't deserve it. I came to say I'm sorry, and to give you this." He handed Kofi the folder. Inside was a notarized trust fund, enough to cover not just flight school but any path he chose with no strings attached. There was also a handwritten letter to Kofi's father addressed to the man who raised a hero. Kofi read it later, alone in his room. It said, "I failed my son by choosing money over morals. You taught mine, by your actions, that there's still good in the world. Thank you for being the light I couldn't be." Kofi cried that night, not from fear or sadness, but from the weight of how one moment could change so many lives. Meanwhile, Elias began to change too. He started visiting the prep school not as a billionaire, but as a guest speaker. He talked about failure, ethics, and the cost of silence. Students listened, not because of his wealth, but because he spoke like someone who'd learned the hard way. He also restructured his foundation. Instead of just funding tech startups, he created a new program, the Watchful Eye Initiative, named after Kofi's habit of noticing small things. It would offer scholarships, mentorship, and resources to kids from overlooked communities who showed curiosity, integrity, and the courage to speak up. When Kofi heard about it, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You didn't have to do that." Elias smiled faintly. "You didn't have to shout that day, but you did." As the weeks passed, the threats stopped. The dark sedan never returned. The anonymous messages dried up. Life didn't go back to normal because normal had changed. But it felt safer, more purposeful. One evening, Kofi sat on the porch with Ms. Dolores, watching fireflies blink in the yard. She handed him a glass of sweet tea and said, "You proud of yourself, baby?" He thought about it. "Not proud, just glad I didn't look away." She patted his knee. "That's better than pride. That's peace." And in that quiet moment under a sky full of stars, Kofi finally felt it. Not the thrill of being noticed, but the quiet strength of knowing he'd done the right thing. Even when it was hard, what came next wouldn't be easy. Flight school would test him. The world would throw more challenges his way. But he wasn't the same boy who'd stood at the airport gate, heart pounding, voice trembling. He was someone who knew that sometimes the smallest voice can stop the biggest disaster. And that was enough. Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges. The fear that once coiled in Kofi's chest every time a strange car passed his house had faded, replaced by a quiet steadiness. He still checked his surroundings, still kept his phone charged and ready, but not out of panic. Out of awareness. He'd learned that paying attention wasn't paranoia. It was responsibility. His days now followed a new rhythm. Mornings at the aviation prep school, where he studied aerodynamics, navigation, and meteorology alongside students who no longer saw him as an outsider, but as someone who actually knew things, not just from books, but from real life. Afternoons were spent back at Hank's garage, though now Hank let him handle engine diagnostics and even supervise younger apprentices. "You got the hands of a mechanic and the mind of a pilot," Hank would grumble, but there was pride in his voice. Evenings belonged to flight simulators, homework, and long talks with Ms. Dolores on the porch. She never asked for details about Elias or Roland, but she watched Kofi closely, noticing how his shoulders had relaxed, how he laughed more easily now. Elias, for his part, kept his distance, not out of coldness but respect. He sent occasional messages, dropped off a new textbook or a rare aviation journal, and once surprised Kofi by showing up at a school open house, standing in the back of the room like any other parent. No entourage, no spotlight. Just a man watching a kid he'd come to care about take his next steps. But the real shift came when Roland reappeared, not as a threat, not as a shadow, but as a man trying to rebuild. He'd started volunteering at a youth center in East Atlanta, teaching basic finance to teenagers who'd never had a bank account. He wore worn jeans and a faded polo shirt, no longer the polished executive. People didn't recognize him, and he liked it that way. One Saturday, Kofi's prep school organized a community outreach day at that same center. Kofi didn't know Roland would be there, until he walked into the computer lab and saw him helping a group of kids set up budgeting spreadsheets. Their eyes met. Roland froze. Then slowly, he nodded. Kofi didn't walk away. He walked over. "You're teaching them about money?" Kofi asked. Roland gave a small, tired smile. "Trying to, so they don't make the same mistakes I did." They didn't talk about the past, not then. But over the next few weeks, their paths crossed more often. Roland never pushed, never asked for forgiveness. He just showed up, did the work, and let his actions speak. One afternoon, as they both waited for a bus after a joint school community event, Roland finally said, "I see you flying one day. Not just as a hobby, as your life." Kofi looked at him. "You really think so?" "I know so," Roland said. "Because you don't just dream about the sky, you respect it. You study it. You listen to it." He paused. "I spent my life chasing numbers on a screen. You pay attention to the world." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to Kofi in a long time. Meanwhile, Elias had been quietly reshaping his own world. He'd stepped back from day-to-day operations at Viridian, handing leadership to a new CEO who shared his growing belief that business should serve people, not just profit. He poured more energy into the foundation, and the Watchful Eye initiative was already supporting 24 students across the country. Kids who'd noticed something wrong in their schools, their neighborhoods, even their families, and had the courage to speak up. One of them had reported a gas leak in her apartment building. Another had flagged forged documents at a local nonprofit. None of them were heroes in the traditional sense. But they'd all chosen to act when it would have been easier to stay silent. Kofi read their stories in the Foundation's newsletter. It made him feel less alone. Then came the invitation. It arrived in a plain envelope, no logo, just his name handwritten on the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "You've earned your wings, not on paper, but in character. We'd be honored if you'd take your first solo flight with us. Date June 12th, location, Embry-Riddle Campus, Daytona Beach." Below it was a note in Elias's handwriting. "I'll be there. So will your grandmother. Don't be late." Kofi's hand shook as he read it. Solo flight. The moment every student pilot both dreams of and dreads. No instructor beside you. Just you, the plane, and the sky. It was the ultimate test of trust in your training, your judgment, and yourself. He told Ms. Dolores that night over dinner. She didn't say much, just reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Your daddy would have loved this," she whispered. The weeks leading up to the flight were intense. Kofi doubled his simulator hours, reviewed emergency procedures until they were muscle memory, and even practiced takeoffs and landings in his sleep. His instructor, a no-nonsense former Navy pilot named Captain Ruiz, watched him closely. "You've got the skills," she told him one afternoon after a flawless pattern session. "But flying solo isn't about skill. It's about calm. Can you stay calm when it's just you up there?" Kofi thought about the day at the airport. The shouting, the silence, the weight of knowing lives were in his hands. "I think I can," he said. The night before the flight, Elias picked him and Ms. Dolores up in a modest sedan. No SUV, no driver. He'd flown them down to Daytona himself in a small Cessna, just to show Kofi that even billionaires sometimes fly coach, so to speak. They stayed in a quiet beachside inn. That evening, the three of them walked along the shore as the sun dipped into the ocean. Ms. Dolores held Elias's arm like he was family. Kofi walked a few steps behind, listening to them talk about nothing important. Weather, sweet tea recipes, the stubbornness of old cars. It was peaceful, real. The next morning, the sky was clear, the wind light and steady. Perfect flying weather. At the airfield, Kofi's assigned aircraft, a Cessna 172, sat waiting, its white paint gleaming in the sun. Ground crew gave it a final check. Captain Ruiz handed him the keys. "You ready?" Kofi took a deep breath. "As I'll ever be." He climbed in, strapped himself in, ran through the checklist with the calm precision he'd practiced 100 times. Then, with a gentle push of the throttle, the plane began to roll down the runway. Liftoff was smooth. The ground fell away. And then, silence except for the hum of the engine and the whisper of wind over the wings. He was alone. For the first few minutes, his heart raced. Not from fear, but from awe. Below him, the coastline stretched like a painting. Palm trees, rooftops, the glint of the Atlantic, all small, quiet, beautiful. He leveled off at 3,000 feet, made his first turn, checked his instruments. Everything was where it should be, and in that moment he thought of his father. He imagined him standing at that old airport fence, pointing up at a plane just like this one, saying, "One day, son, one day you'll be up there." Tears pricked his eyes, but he smiled. Back on the ground, Ms. Dolores wiped her own tears with the hem of her dress. Elias stood beside her, arms crossed, but his eyes were bright. When Kofi taxied back and shut down the engine, they were the first ones at the wing. "You did it," Ms. Dolores said, pulling him into a hug. Kofi nodded, still buzzing with adrenaline. "I did." Elias didn't hug him. He just placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Your father saw you up there." "I know he did." Later that day, as they packed up to leave, Roland showed up unexpectedly. He stood at the edge of the tarmac holding a small wrapped box. He didn't approach until Kofi noticed him. "I didn't want to intrude," Roland said, "but I couldn't miss this." He handed Kofi the box. Inside was a vintage pilot's logbook, leather-bound with crisp blank pages. On the first page, Roland had written, "For the flights ahead. May you always fly with your eyes open and your heart true." Kofi looked up. "Thank you," Roland nodded. "Keep watching, Kofi. The world needs people like you." As they drove back to Atlanta that evening, Kofi sat in the back seat, the logbook in his lap, the hum of the highway beneath them. He wasn't the same boy who'd shouted at a billionaire at an airport gate. He was someone steadier, wiser, shaped by choices and consequences. And though his journey was far from over, there would be harder flights, tougher decisions, moments of doubt. He knew one thing for certain. He would never stop paying attention. Because sometimes, the smallest voice is the one that saves everything. Years have a way of folding moments into memory, softening the edges but keeping the heart of them alive. For Kofi, the day he shouted at the airport gate never faded. It just became part of who he was, like the calluses on his hands from turning wrenches or the quiet focus in his eyes when he studied a flight plan. It wasn't a story he told often, but it was the reason he never stopped listening, never stopped looking closely, never assumed everything was fine just because it seemed that way. Now 23, Kofi stood on the tarmac at Embry-Riddle's main campus in Daytona Beach, dressed in a crisp flight instructor uniform, name stitched neatly over his heart. The Florida sun warmed his shoulders as he checked the fuel levels on the Cessna, Pawn 72 he'd be flying with his newest student, a nervous 18-year-old from rural Alabama who'd never been in a plane before. Kofi remembered that feeling well. "Don't worry," he said, catching the kid's wide-eyed stare. "Flying isn't about being fearless. It's about knowing what to do when things get shaky." The student nodded, gripping his flight bag like a lifeline. Kofi smiled. "First rule, trust your training. Second rule, pay attention to the small stuff. The rest will follow." As they taxied out, Kofi glanced toward the observation deck near the hangar. He didn't have to look hard to spot them. Ms. Dolores in her Sunday best, a wide-brimmed hat shielding her eyes, waving with both hands like he was leaving on a year-long voyage. Beside her stood Elias, older now, hair more silver than black, but posture just as straight. He didn't wave. He just gave a single firm nod, the kind that said, "I knew you'd get here." And behind them, standing a respectful distance away, was Roland. He came to every major milestone now, not as a guest of honor, but as someone who'd earned the right to witness what his choices had almost destroyed. He never spoke much, but he always brought something: a book on aviation history, a model plane, once even a handwritten note for Kofi's student. Ask questions, always. Kofi's journey hadn't followed a straight path. After his solo flight, he'd earned his private pilot's license, then his commercial, then his instructor rating. He turned down lucrative offers from cargo airlines and private charter companies. Instead, he chose to teach, First at Embry-Riddle's outreach program, then through the Watchful Eye initiative, which now had chapters in 10 states. He traveled to high schools in forgotten towns, showing kids that aviation wasn't just for the wealthy or well-connected. All it took was curiosity, discipline, and the courage to speak up when something didn't feel right. He'd even gone back to Hank's garage one summer, not to fix cars, but to help design a youth apprenticeship program that blended mechanical skills with drone technology and flight theory. Hank, now in his 70s, still ran the place with the same gruff love, and he'd proudly hung Kofi's first instructor certificate on the wall, beside a faded photo of Kofi's father. Life hadn't been perfect. There were setbacks, failed exams, mechanical failures mid-flight, days when doubt crept in like fog. But each time, Kofi remembered that afternoon at the private terminal, the smell of acetone in the air, the weight of knowing lives were on the line. If he could stand there, heart pounding, and say what needed to be said, he could handle anything. Alias, too, had changed in ways no one expected. He'd sold most of his shares in Viridian and poured his energy into education and ethics in tech. He funded labs where students built AI systems with built-in accountability checks. He spoke at conferences not about profit margins, but about moral responsibility. And every year, without fail, he attended the Watchful Eye graduation ceremony, where he'd shake each student's hand and say, "The world needs your eyes." He never took credit for Kofi's success. "I just opened a door," he'd say. He walked through it on his own, but those who knew them both understood it was more than that. It was trust. It was second chances. It was two lives intersecting at the exact moment both needed to be reminded that people matter more than power. One evening, after a long day of flight reviews, Kofi sat with Elias on a bench overlooking the runway. The sun was setting, painting the sky in oranges and purples. Planes came and went like silent birds returning home. "You ever think about that day?" Elias asked quietly. "Every time I buckle into a cockpit," Kofi said. "Not because I'm scared, but because it reminds me why I do this. It's not just about flying. It's about watching out for each other." Elias nodded. "I used to think success was building something no one could touch. Now I think it's building something that helps people stand taller." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Elias reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. "I've been holding on to this for a while. Thought today was the right time." Inside was a deed, not to a house or a car, but to a small plot of land near Atlanta, right next to the old airport fence where Kofi and his father used to watch planes. On it, plans were drawn for a community aviation center. Classrooms, simulators, a small hangar, and a memorial garden with a bench engraved with his father's name. Kofi's throat tightened. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," Elias said. "But your father loved the sky, and you gave me back my life so I could keep loving mine. This is just giving it back to where it started." The center opened 6 months later. Kofi named it the Horizon Project. It wasn't fancy, just a modest building with big windows facing the runway, filled with kids from neighborhoods like the one he grew up in. Some came for the science. Some came because they'd never seen a real plane up close. Others came because they'd been told they'd never amount to anything, and they wanted to prove that wrong. Kofi taught them all the same lesson. Flying isn't magic. It's paying attention to the wind, to the instruments, to the people counting on you. And sometimes, when the afternoon light was just right, he'd take a student up in a small trainer plane, climb to a few thousand feet and say, "Look down. See that house with the blue roof? That's where I lived with my grandma. And that fence over there? That's where my dad taught me to dream." The student would stare in awe and Kofi would smile, knowing he was passing on more than knowledge. He was passing on hope. Back at the opening ceremony, Ms. Dolores cut the ribbon with trembling hands. Roland stood in the back, clapping harder than anyone. And Elias, he didn't give a speech. He just watched Kofi greet a group of wide-eyed kids, crouching down to their level, showing them how a propeller works with his hands. Later, as the crowd thinned and the sun dipped below the trees, Kofi walked alone to the memorial bench. He sat for a long time, watching a jet climb into the evening sky, its lights blinking like distant stars. He didn't say anything out loud. He didn't need to. Somewhere up there, he knew his father was proud, and somewhere down here, a new generation was learning that one voice, clear, honest, and brave, can change everything. Kofi stood, brushed the dust from his pants, and walked back toward the hangar. There were more students waiting, more lessons to teach, more skies to explore, and he was ready.